Title: The Phantom Freight. Jake Grizzly Thompson had been a trucker for over 20 years. He'd driven through every state, crossed desolate deserts, navigated icy mountain passes, and weathered treacherous storms. But nothing ever rattled him. His nickname, Grizzly, came from his massive frame, thick beard, and the way he could handle anything the road threw his way. But as every trucker knows, the highway has its own set of rules, and sometimes it doesn't play fair. On a cold October night, Jake was hauling a load of construction equipment through the Appalachian Mountains. The road was narrow, winding, and shrouded in dense fog that clung to the hillsides like a ghostly veil. The radio crackled with static, interrupted occasionally by faint, unintelligible voices. Jake didn't care much for company. He was used to the isolation. But tonight was different. The fog was thicker than usual, and an unsettling feeling gnawed at him. He'd heard stories from other truckers about Route 49, tales of ghostly apparitions, phantom trucks, and drivers who'd gone missing without a trace. Jake had always dismissed them as nonsense, stories cooked up to pass the time during long hauls. But as the night wore on, he found himself glancing nervously at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. Around midnight, the fog became so dense that Jake could barely see more than a few feet ahead. He slowed the rig down, creeping along at a crawl, when his headlights suddenly illuminated a figure standing on the side of the road. The man was tall, gaunt, and dressed in a dirty, torn flannel shirt and jeans. He was holding a sign that read, "Need a ride. We'll pay in gold." Jake frowned. He'd heard of hitchhikers before, but out here in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, it didn't feel right. He debated whether to stop, but decided against it. His gut told him to keep moving, and he always trusted his gut. As Jake passed the man, the hitchhiker's head snapped toward the truck, and their eyes met for a brief moment. The man's eyes were a strange, piercing blue that seemed to glow in the darkness. Jake shuddered and pressed on the gas, eager to put distance between him and the stranger. But a mile down the road, Jake felt a sudden chill in the cab. The temperature seemed to drop by several degrees, and his breath misted in the cold air. His heart began to race as he glanced at the passenger seat and saw the hitchhiker sitting there, staring straight ahead. Jake slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded to a stop. He turned to confront the man, but the seat was empty. The hitchhiker had vanished. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his hands trembling on the wheel. He took a deep breath and trying to calm his nerves. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe it was a trick of the fog. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. He decided to keep driving, hoping to outrun whatever was haunting him. But the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning through the foggy mountains. Every time he glanced at the passenger seat, he half expected to see the hitchhiker sitting there again. Then, just as he began to relax, Jake saw headlights approaching in his side mirror. A large truck was gaining on him, fast. The vehicle was all chrome and steel, gleaming even through the thick fog. Its headlights were blinding, reflecting off Jake's mirrors and turning the cab into a glaring hell. Jake signaled to let the truck pass, but it didn't. Instead, it rode up close to his bumper, as if trying to force him off the road. He could feel the other truck's presence, a malevolent force pressing down on him. Desperate to escape, Jake floored the gas pedal, but the mysterious truck matched his speed. He swerved to the right, trying to make space, but the other truck followed, nearly clipping his rig. Panic set in as Jake realized the truck wasn't trying to pass. It was hunting him. Suddenly, the phantom truck roared its horn, a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the mountains like a wail from hell. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he fought to maintain control of his rig. But the road was narrow, and with the fog and the blinding lights, he knew it was only a matter of time before something went wrong. And then it happened. The road took a sharp turn to the left, but Jake was too distracted by the phantom truck to react in time. His rig veered off the road, crashing through the guardrail and plummeting down the steep hillside. The last thing Jake saw before everything went black was the phantom truck speeding away into the fog. When Jake came to, he was still strapped in his seat, his rig lying on its side in a ravine. The windshield was shattered and his head throbbed with pain, but he was alive. As Jake struggled to free himself from the wreckage, He heard a faint noise like the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. He looked up and saw the hitchhiker standing a few feet away, staring at him with those eerie blue eyes. "You didn't stop," the man said, his voice cold and hollow. "You should have stopped." Jake's blood ran cold. He tried to speak, to apologize, but his voice failed him. The hitchhiker took a step closer, his eyes glowing brighter. "You made your choice," the man whispered. "Now, you're one of us." Before Jake could react, the hitchhiker reached out and touched his forehead. A searing pain shot through Jake's skull and he screamed in agony. His vision blurred and his body felt like it was being torn apart. And then, just as suddenly, the pain stopped. Jake opened his eyes, but the world was different. Everything was bathed in a sickly, greenish light, and the air felt thick and oppressive. The last stop. Roy Mason was a veteran trucker who had spent most of his life on the open road. He'd driven coast to coast, from bustling cities to the most remote corners of the country. He had a reputation for being reliable, punctual, and fearless. But there was one route he dreaded, a stretch of highway that every trucker knew but few talked about, the Devil's Fork. Devil's Fork was a lonely, winding road that cut through a thick forest in the heart of Tennessee. It was the kind of place that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. There were no lights, no signs of civilization, just miles of darkness and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. The road had a sinister reputation. Some said it was cursed, that trucks would vanish without a trace, swallowed by the dense forest. Others spoke of ghostly apparitions, of drivers who had gone mad after driving through. Roy had always dismissed these stories as nonsense, trucker lore meant to scare rookies. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that place. Still, he had a job to do, and tonight, his route took him straight through Devil's Fork. It was just after midnight when Roy reached the entrance to the fork. The sky was moonless, and the trees on either side of the road seemed to close in as if trying to swallow him whole. He switched on his high beams, the bright lights cutting through the darkness but offering little comfort. The road was eerily silent, no animals, no wind, just the hum of his engine and the crunch of gravel under his tires. Roy kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts wandered to the stories he'd heard. He told himself to focus. He was a professional, not some greenhorn to be scared by campfire tales. As he drove deeper into the forest, the fog began to roll in, thick and heavy. It clung to the ground, swirling around the tires of his truck like ghostly tendrils. Roy slowed down, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The fog grew thicker, and soon he could barely see a few feet ahead of him. That's when he saw it. A gas station, its neon flickering in the fog like a dying flame. Roy frowned. He'd driven this route before, and there was no gas station on Devil's Fork. But there it was. Clear as day, a small, rundown station with a single pump and a dimly lit store. Roy's truck was running low on fuel, and despite his unease, he decided to stop. He pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under his tires as he came to a halt. The station looked like it hadn't been used in years. The windows were dirty, the paint peeling off the walls, and the old pump looked like it hadn't dispensed gas in decades. But the lights were on, and as Roy stepped out of his truck, he noticed a figure inside the store. It was an old man, hunched over the counter, his face obscured by shadows. Roy hesitated for a moment before heading inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and a bell above the door jingled weakly. The interior of the store was as decrepit as the outside. Shelves were lined with dust-covered cans, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. The old man looked up as Roy approached the counter. His eyes were pale and cloudy, and his skin had the sickly hue of someone who hadn't seen the sun in years. "Evening," Roy said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Need to fill up." The old man nodded slowly, as if every movement was a great effort. "Pump's ready," he rasped, his voice dry and brittle like old paper. "Pay inside when you're done." Roy nodded and went back outside to fill his tank. As he pumped the gas, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around, but the road was empty, and the forest was silent. Still, the feeling persisted, gnawing at the back of his mind. When the tank was full, Roy returned to the store to pay. The old man hadn't moved. He stood behind the counter, watching Roy with those pale, lifeless eyes. "That'll be $50. the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Roy handed over the cash, eager to get back on the road. As he did, his hand brushed against the man's, and he recoiled at the touch. The old man's skin was ice cold, like touching a corpse. "Drive safe," the man said, his voice hollow. Roy mumbled a thank you and hurried back to his truck. As he climbed into the cab, he glanced back at the station and saw the old man standing in the doorway, watching him. The fog swirled around him, obscuring his figure, and for a moment, Roy thought he saw something moving in the shadows behind the man, something tall and dark, with glowing eyes. He shook his head and started the engine, eager to put as much distance between him and the gas station as possible. As he pulled out of the lot, he glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see the station fade into the fog. But when he looked, there was nothing there. No station, no sign, just an empty stretch of road disappearing into the darkness. Roy's heart skipped a beat. He glanced back at the road, then at the mirror again, but the station was gone. It was as if it had never been there at all. His mind raced. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was it a hallucination brought on by exhaustion? But the receipt in his pocket, the fuel in his tank, they were real, weren't they? As Roy drove on, the fog began to lift and the forest thinned out. The uneasy feeling in his gut subsided, replaced by a deep, bone-weary fatigue. He just wanted to reach the next town, find a place to sleep, and forget about the night. But as he approached the outskirts of the next town, something caught his eye. A small, abandoned gas station. Its sign faded and its windows boarded up. It looked eerily similar to the one he had just left. Roy's hands tightened on the wheel as he slowed down to get a better look. The pump was rusted, the paint peeling, and the store was dark and empty. But there, on the counter inside, was a dusty, old register. And next to it, a stack of receipts identical to the one in Roy's pocket. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the truth. The station hadn't disappeared. It had never existed, not in this world at least. Roy sped away, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of a well-lit truck stop miles away. As he sat in the cab trying to make sense of what had happened, he pulled out the receipt from his pocket. The ink had faded, but the name at the bottom was still legible. Mason's Gas Station, Est, 1955. The receipt was dated October 31st, 1965, the same night the station had burned down, killing the owner and his family inside. Roy stared at the receipt, his hands shaking. The stories were true. Devil's Fork was cursed, and tonight he'd driven straight through its heart. He crumpled the receipt and threw it out the window, vowing never to return. But as he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't seen the last of Devil's Fork, that one day the road would call him back, and when it did, there would be no escaping its grasp. Title: The road was long and empty, a black ribbon cutting through the heart of nowhere. Jimmy Red Carson was on the last leg of his cross-country haul, eager to get home. It had been a grueling trip, one filled with unexpected detours and delays. But tonight, everything seemed calm, almost too calm. The sky was clear, the moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape. There wasn't another soul in sight, just miles of open road stretching ahead of him. Jimmy was a seasoned trucker, having spent more than 15 years behind the wheel. He was used to the isolation, the long hours of solitude where the only company was the hum of the engine and the distant howl of the wind. But there was something about tonight that made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to creep along the edges of his headlights, or how the silence felt thick, oppressive, like a weight on his chest. He turned up the radio, hoping to shake the feeling, but all he got was static. Frustrated, he switched it off and focused on the road. He was about to cross the stretch known as Deadman's Curve, a notorious bend where the road seemed to disappear into the hills. The locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed. Jimmy didn't believe in curses, but he knew the curve was dangerous. More than one truck had gone off the road here, never to be seen again. As he approached the curve, his headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, dressed in white, her long hair hanging down to her waist. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring straight ahead. Jimmy's first instinct was to slow down, but something told him not to. He had heard stories about hitchhikers on this stretch of road, ghostly figures who vanished as soon as you got close. But this woman looked real, too real to ignore. As he drew closer, Jimmy noticed that she was barefoot, her pale feet blending into the gravel. She looked out of place, like she didn't belong on this lonely road. Against his better judgment, Jimmy pulled over. The woman turned to face him, and for a moment their eyes met. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and there was something unsettling about them. They didn't seem to reflect the light, as if they absorbed it instead. "Need a ride?" Jimmy called out, his voice betraying a hint of the unease he felt. The woman nodded silently and approached the truck. As she climbed into the cab, Jimmy noticed that her skin was cold, almost icy to the touch. She settled into the passenger seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to make conversation. "Just down the road," she replied in a soft, almost whispering voice. There was something off about her tone, something that sent a shiver down Jimmy's spine. But he didn't press her. Something told him it was better not to know. They drove in silence for a few miles, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the occasional creak of the cab. Jimmy kept his eyes on the road, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was watching him, studying him. He glanced over at her, and for a split second he saw something in the rearview mirror. Another figure, sitting right behind him. He did a double take, but when he looked again, there was nothing there, just the empty seats behind him. "You all right?" the woman asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "Yeah," Jimmy muttered, shaking his head. "Just tired, I guess." "You should be careful on this road," she said, her tone suddenly serious. "People tend to lose their way here." "I know the road," Jimmy replied, a little more defensively than he intended. But as he said it, a sharp turn appeared out of nowhere. He barely had time to react, yanking the wheel to the left to avoid going off the road. The truck skidded, tires screeching on the asphalt, but he managed to regain control. "That curve wasn't supposed to be there," Jimmy muttered under his breath, his heart racing. The woman didn't respond. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. Jimmy couldn't take it anymore. The silence, the tension. It was too much. "Look, where exactly are you going?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Home," she replied simply. "And where's home?" Jimmy pressed. "Not far now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "just past the curve." Jimmy frowned. He knew every inch of this road, and there was nothing past Edmonds Curve except miles of empty wilderness. But before he could say anything, the fog started to roll in, thick and heavy, swallowing the road ahead. Jimmy slowed down, squinting through the fog. The headlights barely cut through it, illuminating only a few feet ahead. And then he saw it, a bend in the road that hadn't been there before. He didn't have time to react. The truck barreled into the curve, the wheels losing grip, as the cab veered off the road. Jimmy tried to brake, but the fog was too thick, the road too slick. The truck skidded, the back end fishtailing wildly before it crashed through the guardrail. The world spun around him as the truck tumbled down the hillside, metal screeching, glass shattering. Jimmy's head slammed against the steering wheel, and everything went black. When he came to, the cab was on its side, smoke billowing from the engine. His head throbbed, and every bone in his body ached. But he was alive. He fumbled for his seatbelt, struggling to free himself from the wreckage. As he did, he noticed that the woman was gone. The passenger seat was empty, at the door hanging open, swinging back and forth in the wind. Jimmy crawled out of the cab, his legs shaking as he tried to stand. The fog had lifted, revealing the twisted wreckage of his truck, scattered across the hillside. But there was no sign of the woman. No footprints, no blood, nothing. He looked around, dazed and confused, trying to make sense of what had happened. That's when he saw it, in the distance. An old, dilapidated house, its windows dark and lifeless. It was perched on the edge of the hillside, barely visible through the fog. It looked ancient, like it had been abandoned for years. Jimmy staggered toward the house, drawn by some inexplicable force. As he got closer, he saw that the front door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The interior was cold, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. But there was something else, something that made Jimmy's blood run cold. In the center of the room was a large mirror, its surface cracked and stained with age. Jimmy approached the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. As he looked into it, he saw the reflection of the room behind him, and standing there in the doorway was the woman. But she wasn't alone. Behind her were more figures, shadowy shapes that flickered in and out of focus. They were watching him, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jimmy spun around, but the room was empty. He was alone. But when he looked back at the mirror, the figures were still there, growing closer, their hands reaching out toward him. Panicking, Jimmy backed away, but the floor gave way beneath him. He fell, tumbling through the darkness, the mirror's surface shattering as he plunged into the void. When he hit the ground, everything went silent. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was the woman's face, pale and cold, staring down at him with those dark, empty eyes. When Jimmy was found the next morning, he was lying in the middle of Deadman's Curve, his truck nowhere in sight. The wreckage had vanished, along with any trace of the woman. The authorities chalked it up to a freak accident, a case of a trucker losing control on a dangerous stretch of road. But those who knew Jimmy, those who had driven the same route, whispered of something more sinister. They said the woman was a ghost, a spirit trapped in the fog of Deadman's Curve, luring drivers to their doom. And now, Jimmy was part of the legend, another lost soul claimed by the cursed road. As the years passed, the stories grew, and so did the sightings. More drivers reported seeing the woman in white standing by the side of the road waiting for her next ride, and every time someone went missing, they'd find a broken mirror, cracked and stained with age, lying in the middle of the curve, as if marking the spot where another soul had been taken. Title: The Rest Stop. Eddie Morrow had been on the road for nearly 12 hours straight, his eyes burning from the constant glare of headlights and the monotony of the endless interstate. He was a long-haul trucker, used to the grind, but tonight something felt different. The air was thick with humidity, clinging to his skin and making it hard to breathe. The road was unusually empty, not another vehicle in sight, just miles of asphalt stretching into the dark. He was somewhere in Louisiana, a place where the swamps met the highway, where the air was thick with the smell of decay and the hum of insects. Eddie had just driven this route before, but tonight, everything seemed off. The trees loomed closer to the road, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the mist that rose from the ground seemed almost alive, swirling in unnatural patterns under the pale moonlight. Eddie was bone-tired, his eyelids heavy, and he knew he needed to stop soon. Up ahead, he spotted a sign: Rest Stop, 2 miles. He let out a sigh of relief and pushed on, eager to pull over and catch some sleep. The rest stop came into view, a small, dimly lit area with a few parking spots, a restroom, and a vending machine that looked like it hadn't been stocked in years. It wasn't much, but it would do. Eddie pulled his rig into the lot and parked, turning off the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening. He stepped out of the truck, stretching his stiff limbs and taking a deep breath of the heavy, humid air. The place was deserted, not a single car or truck in sight. The only sound was the distant croaking of frogs and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Eddie made his way to the restroom, the fluorescent light flickering overhead as he pushed open the door. The inside was grimy, with cracked tiles and a lingering smell of mildew. He quickly did his business, like splashed some water on his face and stepped back outside. As he walked back to his truck, he noticed something strange, a faint, rhythmic thudding sound, like footsteps, but uneven and heavy. Eddie stopped and listened, his heart beginning to race. The sound was coming from the trees, just beyond the edge of the rest stop, where the forest grew thick and dark. Probably just an animal, Eddie muttered to himself, though his voice lacked conviction. He quickened his pace, eager to get back to the safety of his truck, but as he neared the door, the thudding grew louder, closer. Eddie glanced over his shoulder, but saw nothing, just the dark outline of trees against the night sky. He climbed into the cab and locked the doors, his pulse quickening. The interior of the truck felt stifling, the air thick and oppressive. Eddie tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just the fatigue playing tricks on his mind. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and tried to relax. But the thudding sound didn't stop. It seemed to circle the truck, slow and deliberate, like something was pacing around outside. Eddie's eyes snapped open, his breath catching in his throat. He reached for the ignition, ready to start the engine and get the hell out of there, but something stopped him. A shadow, moving just outside the window. Eddie froze, his hand hovering over the key. The shadow was tall, impossibly tall, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. It passed in front of the truck, blocking out the light for a moment before disappearing into the darkness. For a few seconds, there was silence, then a loud thud against the side of the truck, followed by the sound of nails scratching against metal. Eddie's heart pounded in his chest, and he fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. He started the engine, the roar of the diesel breaking the silence, but the scratching continued, more frantic now, as if whatever was out there was trying to get inside. Eddie slammed his foot on the gas, the truck lurching forward as he tore out of the rest stop. He didn't look back, didn't dare to. The thudding sound faded into the distance, replaced by the steady hum of the engine and the pounding of his own heart. He drove for miles, not stopping until he was sure he was far from whatever had been at that rest stop. Finally, he pulled over at a well-lit truck stop, lighting up the neon signs a welcome sight. He parked the truck, turned off the engine, and sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white. What the hell was that? He couldn't shake the image of that shadow, the unnatural way it moved, the sound of those footsteps. It had to be some kind of animal, maybe a bear, he told himself, though deep down he knew that wasn't true. Eddie finally forced himself to get out of the truck, needing to stretch his legs and clear his head. The air here was cooler, less oppressive, and the truck stop was busy with other drivers and travelers. He walked around to the side of his rig, wanting to check for any damage. What he saw made his blood run cold. The side of the truck was covered in deep, jagged scratches, the kind no animal could make. The metal was gouged, the paint peeled away, and in the dim light, Eddie could see something else, something that made his stomach churn. A handprint, large and misshapen, pressed into the metal as if it had been burned there. The fingers were long, too long, and the palm was twisted, deformed. Eddie stared at it, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him. "You see it too, huh?" Eddie spun around to find another trucker standing a few feet away, an older man with a grizzled beard and tired eyes. He was staring at the handprint, his expression grim. What the hell is that?" Eddie stammered. The old man shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but you ain't the first to see it." Eddie's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The old man sighed, looking around as if to make sure no one else was listening. "There's something out there on the roads, something that don't belong in this world. I've heard stories, seen things myself. Whatever it is, it's been around for a long time." Eddie felt a chill run down his spine. "And the rest stop? The one back there in the middle of nowhere?" The old man nodded. "That place? Yeah, it's a trap. It shows up when it wants to. And when you stop there, well, you've seen what happens. You're lucky you got away." Eddie's mind reeled. A trap? A rest stop that wasn't always there? It sounded insane, but the evidence was right there on his truck. "What do I do now?" Eddie asked, his voice shaky. The old man gave him a hard look. "You keep driving, and you never, ever stop at a place you don't recognize. If something don't feel right, you keep moving. And whatever you do, don't look back." Eddie nodded, his throat dry. The old man turned and walked away, leaving Eddie standing there, staring at the handprint burned into his truck. He didn't know what he had encountered that night, but one thing was clear. The road was no longer the familiar, safe place he had always known. Something was out there, something that hunted in the dark, waiting for its next victim to make the fatal mistake of stopping. Eddie climbed back into his truck, his hands still trembling as he started the engine. He pulled out of the truck stop and merged back onto the highway, his eyes scanning the road ahead, his senses on high alert. The miles passed slowly, each one bringing him closer to home, but Eddie knew he would never truly feel safe again. The open road had changed, and so had he. Now, every rest stop, every shadowy figure on the side of the road would be a reminder of that night, of the thing that had almost claimed him. And somewhere out there in the dark, it was still waiting. Title: The Ghost Freight. Calvin "Cal" Mercer was a trucker by trade and a loner by nature. He had crisscrossed the country more times than he could count, spending more nights on the road than in his own bed. He loved the solitude, the freedom of the open road, and the steady hum of his 18-wheeler beneath him. But there was one route he had always avoided, the stretch of highway through the Black Ridge Mountains. The stories about Black Ridge were well known among truckers. There were whispers of trucks disappearing, strange lights in the sky, and ghostly apparitions that haunted the narrow mountain passes. Cal didn't believe in ghost stories, but he didn't tempt fate either. The Black Ridge route was treacherous enough without adding the possibility of the supernatural into the mix. But this time, he didn't have a choice. He was running behind schedule, and the only way to make his delivery on time was to cut through Black Ridge. It was just a bunch of tall tales, he told himself. Nothing to worry about. He'd take it slow, keep his eyes on the road, and he'd be through the mountains before midnight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Cal found himself at the base of the mountains, the narrow road winding upward into the dark. The trees closed in around him, their branches clawing at the sky like bony fingers. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to rise, wrapping around the truck like a shroud. Cal gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. The fog was dense, almost impenetrable, and it swallowed up the headlights, leaving only a few feet of visibility. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rumble of the engine and the occasional groan of the truck as it navigated the sharp turns. It wasn't long before Cal started to feel uneasy. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the fog grew thicker, so thick that it felt like a living thing, pressing in on him from all sides. He checked the clock on the dashboard. It should have been midnight by now, but the clock had stopped, the glowing digits frozen in time. Cal cursed under his breath, tapping the clock with his finger, but it didn't budge. The radio was nothing but static, and even the CB was silent, which was unusual on this route. It was like he was the only person left in the world, driving through an endless night with no end in sight. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Cal saw something move in the fog. A shadow, large and looming, passed by the side of the truck, just out of sight. He jerked the wheel, nearly sending the truck off the road as he swerved to avoid it. But when he looked again, there was nothing there, just the thick, swirling fog. Cal's heart raced. He was a rational man, but the stories of Black Ridge were starting to creep into his mind. He took a deep breath and tried to focus. He'd been driving for years. He knew how to handle a little fog, but no amount of experience could shake the feeling that he wasn't alone on that road. A few miles later, the fog began to lift and the road straightened out. Cal let out a sigh of relief. Maybe he was through the worst of it. But as the fog cleared, something appeared in the distance, a pair of taillights, glowing red in the darkness. Cal's brow furrowed. He hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, but here was a truck, just ahead of him, moving slowly up the mountain pass. It was an old rig, the kind you didn't see much anymore, with rusted sides and a faded logo that was barely legible in the dark. He slowed down, keeping a safe distance behind the truck. Something about it didn't sit right with him. The way it moved was strange, almost sluggish, like it was struggling to climb the hill. And then there was the smell, an acrid, burning odor that filled the cab, making Cal's eyes water. He tried to pass it, but the road was too narrow and the truck seemed to weave slightly from side to side, blocking any attempt to overtake. Frustrated, Cal hit the horn, but the sound echoed uselessly into the night. The truck didn't move, didn't react, just kept plodding along at its agonizing pace. As they rounded a bend, the fog thickened again, and the taillights began to flicker, like a candle struggling to stay lit. Cal leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, trying to make out the truck's details. It was old, that much was clear, too old to still be on the road. The trailer was battered, covered in dents and scratches, and the tires looked worn, dangerously thin. Then, the truck ahead did something strange. It started to slow down, coming to a complete stop in the middle of the road. Cal slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding to a halt just inches from the rear of the other vehicle. "What the hell?" Cal muttered, his nerves fraying. He reached for the door handle, intending to get out and give the driver a piece of his mind, but something stopped him. An overwhelming sense of dread, like a cold hand squeezing his heart. Through the fog, he could see the cab of the other truck, dark and silent. No movement, no sign of life, just the glow of the taillights, flickering weakly, like a heartbeat fading away. Cal's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't explain it, but he knew something was wrong. Very wrong. He grabbed the CB radio, trying to call for help, but all he got was static, a low, droning hum that made his skin crawl. Suddenly, the taillights of the other truck went out, plunging the road into darkness. Cal's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his mind racing. He didn't want to get out, didn't want to approach that truck, but he couldn't just sit there either. He had to know what was going on. Summoning all his courage, Cal opened the door and stepped out into the night. The air was freezing, biting through his jacket as he approached the other truck. The fog swirled around him, thick and heavy, muffling the sound of his footsteps on the asphalt. As he reached the rear of the truck, he hesitated. The smell was stronger now, a stench of burning rubber and something else. Something rotten. Cal's stomach turned, but he forced himself to move forward, rounding the side of the truck to peer into the cab. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cab was empty, completely empty. The seat was torn, the dashboard covered in dust, and the windshield cracked and grimy. But that wasn't what made Cal's heart stop. It was the driver's seat, or rather what was left of it. The leather was scorched, blackened as if it had been set on fire. And there, in the middle of the seat, was a dark, human-shaped outline burned into the fabric, like a shadow that had been seared into the material. Cal staggered back, his mind reeling. This truck, it wasn't just old. It was abandoned. Dead. But it was still on the road, still moving with no driver at the wheel. Panic set in, and Cal turned to run back to his truck. But the fog was closing in, thicker than before, suffocating him. The road seemed to stretch out in front of him, endless and dark, and when he looked back, the other truck was gone, vanished into the mist as if it had never been there. Cal stumbled back to his truck, his heart pounding in his chest. He slammed the door shut and fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal, tearing down the mountain pass as fast as he could. The fog clung to him, but he didn't stop, didn't look back. He drove like a man possessed, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and that cursed stretch of road. It wasn't until he reached the edge of the mountains that the fog finally lifted, revealing the clear night sky above. Cal pulled over, his body trembling, and tried to catch his breath. He had no idea how long he had been driving, but the clock on the dashboard still hadn't moved. He sat there for a long time, the events of the night replaying in his mind. That truck, that ghostly title, The Unseen Cargo. Jake Turner had seen his fair share of oddities on the road, from bizarre roadside attractions to the eerie glow of a lone street lamp in the middle of nowhere. The life of a long-haul trucker was never boring, but nothing had prepared him for the night he encountered the unseen cargo. It was a late summer night, and Jake was hauling a load of electronics across the country. The shipment was time-sensitive, and he had been pushing hard to make up for lost time. As he drove through the vast open plains of Nebraska, he saw a sign for a rest area up ahead. Exhausted and craving a break, Jake decided to pull over. The rest area was deserted, a small clearing surrounded by tall grass and a few weathered benches. The parking lot was empty, except for a single, dimly lit service station. Jake parked his rig and climbed out, stretching his legs and taking a deep, deep breath of the cool night air. The stars shone brightly overhead, and the silence was almost soothing after hours of constant engine noise. He headed inside the service station, which was eerily quiet. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. The place had the kind of feel that made Jake uncomfortable, a sense of being watched, even though he was alone. As he walked to the counter, he noticed a door labeled Authorized Personnel Only. It was slightly ajar, revealing a small, cluttered office beyond. Jake's curiosity got the better of him, and he peered inside, but the office was dark and empty. He quickly dismissed it and turned his attention to the vending machines, grabbing a soda and a bag of chips. While he was eating, the door to the service station opened with a jingle, and a man walked in. He was tall and thin, with a scruffy beard and a weathered face. He wore a trucker's cap and a faded jacket, looking as if he had just come in from a long haul. Jake nodded in acknowledgement, but the man didn't seem to notice. Instead, he made a beeline for the office, slipping through the door without a word. Jake shrugged and went back to his snack. A few minutes later, he heard a low rumble coming from outside. Peering through the window, he saw an old, rusty truck parked next to his rig. It was an ancient model with a dented trailer and a faded logo that was almost unrecognizable. The truck's engine was still running, the exhaust spewing thick black smoke. The old trucker emerged from the office carrying a large metal crate. He placed it carefully in the trailer, then climbed into the cab and drove away, leaving the service station in silence once more. Jake's curiosity got the best of him. He decided to investigate the crate, wondering what kind of cargo required such secrecy. He walked over to the trailer, the metal door of the cargo hold slightly ajar. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled it open just enough to peek inside. The crate was large and heavy, with rusted bolts and a padlock that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was no label or indication of what it contained, but Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at it. Something about the crate felt off, an unsettling presence that he couldn't quite place. He decided not to tamper with it, though his curiosity gnawed at him. Instead, he returned to his truck, finished his snack, and prepared to hit the road again. He climbed into the cab and started the engine, the familiar rumble comforting after the eerie stillness of the rest area. As he drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The headlights of his truck cut through the darkness, and the road stretched out before him like a never-ending ribbon. He glanced in the mirrors but saw nothing except the empty highway. The night wore on, and Jake began to feel drowsy. The road was long and straight, the monotony broken only by the occasional flicker of a roadside sign. He turned on the radio to stay alert, but the static and sporadic signals did little to keep him awake. Around midnight, Jake noticed something strange in his rearview mirror, a pair of headlights, glaring bright and close behind him. He checked the mirrors and saw the old truck from the rest area, tailing him closely. It was the same rusty rig, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. Jake felt a pang of unease. He tried to increase his speed, but the old truck kept pace effortlessly, never getting any closer but never falling behind. It was as if the truck was tethered to him, a silent, unrelenting shadow. Hours passed, and the old truck continued to follow. Jake's nerves were frayed, and he started to feel paranoid. Every time he looked in the mirror, the truck was there, its headlights glaring through the fog that had started to roll in. As dawn approached, Jake spotted a small secluded diner on the side of the road and decided to pull over, hoping to clear his head and grab a coffee. He parked the rig and walked inside, the bell above the door jingling as he entered. The diner was empty, except for the cook behind the counter and a lone waitress who seemed to be cleaning up. Jake ordered a coffee and sat at the counter, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. He told the waitress about the old truck following him, but she merely nodded and gave him a knowing look. "You're not the first to see it," she said softly. "That truck's been around for a long time, and it's got a reputation." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" The waitress hesitated, then leaned in closer. "They say it's cursed. The cargo in that truck, it's not something you want to mess with. People who see it often find themselves in trouble. Strange things happen, and the road can get very unpredictable." Jake's stomach tightened. "I just thought it was a coincidence." The waitress shook her head. "There are no coincidences with that truck. If you see it, it's best to keep moving and never look back." Jake finished his coffee in silence, his mind racing. When he left the diner, the old truck was nowhere in sight. The road ahead was clear, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, just out of sight. He climbed back into his rig and drove off, determined to get the cargo to title The Haunting on Route 66. It was just past midnight when Billy Harper, a seasoned long-haul trucker, found himself driving down one of the most famous highways in America, Route 66. Known as the Main Street of America, it stretched from Chicago to Santa Monica. But tonight, Billy was on a desolate stretch in New Mexico, far from the highway's iconic landmarks. The truck's headlights cut through the thick desert darkness, illuminating a road that seemed to go on forever. Billy had been driving for hours, his eyes heavy with fatigue. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio, which had been silent for the past few hours. He had just passed a small, rundown town, barely more than a few scattered buildings and a closed gas station, when he noticed something odd in the distance, a flickering light, like a distant campfire, off the side of the road. Curious and tired, Billy decided to pull over and investigate. He could use a break and maybe find out if there was a place to get some coffee. He parked his rig on the shoulder and stepped out into the cool night air, the stars shining brightly overhead. The flickering light seemed to be coming from a small, dilapidated rest stop. As he approached, he saw that it was a tiny, old-fashioned diner, its neon sign barely glowing and its windows covered in grime. Billy hesitated for a moment, but then pushed open the door. A bell jingled as he entered, and the smell of stale coffee and greasy food hit him. The diner was dimly lit with a few booths and a counter. The place looked like it hadn't been cleaned in decades, but there was something oddly nostalgic about it. He took a seat at the counter and waited. After a few minutes, a middle-aged woman emerged from the back, her apron stained and her face tired. She gave him a tired smile and asked what he wanted. Billy ordered a coffee and a slice of pie, trying to ignore the strange feeling that he was being watched. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed an old newspaper pinned to the wall behind the counter. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearance on Route 66. The article was dated from the 1950s and told the story of a trucker who had vanished without a trace while traveling the same stretch of highway Billy was on. Billy frowned, feeling a shiver run down his spine. He glanced around the diner, noticing that there were no other patrons and no sign of recent activity. The woman behind the counter seemed to be growing more distant, her eyes vacant as she wiped down the counter. "Is this place open all night?" Billy asked, trying to make conversation. The woman looked up, her expression vacant. "We close when the ghosts come out." Billy chuckled nervously. "Ghosts?" The woman didn't respond, just continued to clean the counter with a mechanical precision. The atmosphere in the diner grew heavier and the temperature seemed to drop. Billy tried to shake off the unsettling feeling and focused on his pie, but it tasted bland, almost like cardboard. He finished his coffee quickly and decided it was time to leave. He paid the bill and headed back to his truck, eager to put some distance between himself and the strange diner. As he drove away, the flickering light of the diner faded in his rearview mirror. The road stretched out ahead and Billy tried to put the experience out of his mind. But as the miles passed, he noticed something troubling. His GPS had gone haywire, constantly recalculating as if it couldn't find a signal. The headlights of his truck illuminated the empty highway, and the only sound was the rhythmic thrum of the engine. Billy felt a growing sense of unease, as if the desert itself was closing in around him. He glanced at the clock. It seemed to be stuck, the hands frozen at 3 a.m. Suddenly, the truck's radio crackled to life, the static giving way to a distorted voice. "You shouldn't have stopped," it said, the voice echoing with an eerie resonance. Billy's heart raced as he fumbled with the radio, trying to turn it off, but the static continued, growing louder and more frantic. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He glanced in the mirrors, half expecting to see something following him, but the road was empty. The only light came from his truck's headlights, cutting through the oppressive darkness. Then, out of nowhere, he saw headlights approaching from behind. A truck, old and battered, just like the one he had seen at the diner. It was tailing him closely, its lights glaring through the fog that had begun to roll in. Billy tried to speed up, but the old truck kept pace effortlessly. Panic set in. Billy turned off the radio and focused on the road, but the headlights of the truck behind him grew brighter, almost blinding. He tried to overtake, but the road was too narrow, and the other truck blocked his way. He could see the other truck more clearly now. Its paint was peeling, and its trailer was covered in rust and dents. The headlights were unnaturally bright, and Billy noticed something even more unsettling. The windows of the truck were blacked out, completely opaque. Billy's hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. He tried to contact dispatch on the CB radio, but all he received was static. The truck behind him continued to follow, its presence oppressive and menacing. Just as Billy was about to lose hope, he spotted a small, abandoned gas station on the side of the road. He pulled in, hoping to find some shelter from the relentless pursuit. He parked the truck and looked around, but The gas station was as deserted as the diner, crumbling walls, broken pumps, and an overgrown lot. He got out of the truck, his breath visible in the cold air, and watched as the old truck slowly pulled into the lot behind him. The headlights dimmed and the engine cut out with a groan. Billy's heart pounded as he approached the other truck cautiously. He saw the driver's door open and a figure emerged, a man, old and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a ghostly pallor. The man looked at Billy with a vacant expression and then began to speak in a voice that was both haunting and hollow. "Another traveler lost on the road," the man said. "Another soul to join the rest." Billy's blood ran cold. He turned to run back to his truck, but the old man's voice followed him, echoing in the emptiness. "Route 66 never forgets," the man said, "and neither do we." Billy scrambled into his truck and started the engine, his heart racing. He tore out of the gas station, the old truck's headlights fading in the distance. He drove for hours, his nerves frayed and his mind racing. Finally, he reached a truck stop, its bright lights and bustling atmosphere a welcome relief. He parked and went inside, his hands still trembling. He told the clerk about his experience, but the clerk just nodded as if he had heard the story before. Billy never spoke of the diner or the ghostly truck again. He continued his trucking career, but he avoided that stretch of routes. Title: The Phantom Load. Trucker Dan Riddle was known for his reliability and calm demeanor. He had spent years on the road, earning the respect of his peers for his punctuality and no-nonsense attitude. But as he approached the sleepy town of Red Rock, he was about to face a challenge that would test both his nerves and his sanity. It was a chilly autumn evening when Dan picked up his load from a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town. The facility was old, with peeling paint and a sagging roof, but the foreman assured him that the shipment needed to be delivered urgently. The load was labeled confidential and was packed in a large, nondescript container. The foreman handed Dan a set of papers, which included detailed instructions for the delivery. Dan wasn't one to question the nature of his cargo. As long as it paid well and got him home in time, he was satisfied. Foreman. He loaded the container onto his rig and set off toward his destination, a remote research facility several hours away. The sun had long disappeared behind the horizon when Dan entered the desolate stretch of highway that led to the facility. The road was poorly lit, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in as the night deepened. The only sound was the rhythmic rumble of the truck and the occasional chirping of crickets. Around midnight, Dan noticed something odd. His GPS seemed to be malfunctioning, constantly recalculating as if it couldn't find a signal. The headlights of his truck pierced the darkness, but the road ahead seemed to twist and turn in unexpected ways. He chalked it up to the poor signal and kept driving. As the hours passed, Dan began to feel uneasy. The woods seemed unnaturally still, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air grew colder, and a dense fog began to roll in, obscuring the road ahead. Then, just as Dan was about to pull over and check his maps, he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt mere inches from the figure. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, with a gaunt, hollow-eyed expression. Dan rolled down his window, trying to see if she needed help. "Are you all right?" he called out, but the woman didn't respond. Instead, she just stood there, staring at him with an eerie, vacant gaze. Before he could react, the woman suddenly vanished into the fog. Dan blinked in confusion, wondering if he had imagined the whole thing. He checked his mirrors but saw nothing. Shaking his head, he turned off the truck's engine and climbed out to stretch his legs. As he walked around the rig, he heard a faint, distant sound, like a low, mournful wail. The sound grew louder, echoing through the woods, and Dan felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly got back into the truck and started the engine, eager to get back on the road. The fog thickened, and the road seemed to become increasingly twisted and convoluted. Dan's GPS was still malfunctioning, and he had lost all sense of direction. He drove on, hoping to find some sign of the research facility. Eventually, he saw a faint light in the distance, an old, run-down sign that read, "Red Rock Research Facility." Relieved, Dan followed the sign down a narrow, winding road that led to a dilapidated building surrounded by overgrown weeds. He parked his truck and got out, pulling the container with the confidential cargo towards the entrance. The building was eerily silent, with broken windows and peeling paint. The door creaked open as he pushed it, and he stepped inside. The interior was just as decrepit as the exterior. Dust and cobwebs covered everything, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. Dan made his way to the reception desk, where he found a set of faded instructions left for him. He followed the instructions to a dark, cavernous room in the back of the building. The room was filled with old, rusty equipment and forgotten files. Dan placed the container in the center of the room and prepared to leave, but as he turned to go, he heard a faint sound, like a whispering voice, coming from the darkness. He hesitated, straining to hear. The whispering grew louder, forming coherent words. "Why did you come? Leave now before it's too late." Dan's heart raced. He looked around the room but saw no one. The whispering continued, more insistent. He turned to leave, but the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panic set in. Dan pounded on the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering voices grew louder, filling the room with an almost tangible sense of dread. He looked around, trying to find another way out, but the room seemed to close in on him. Then he noticed something chilling. The container he had delivered was now open, and inside was a tattered journal. He approached it cautiously and opened the journal to find pages filled with frantic scribblings and disturbing sketches of grotesque figures and dark rituals. One entry caught his eye. "The phantom load will always find you. It never rests." As he read the entry, the temperature in the room plummeted, and a ghostly figure materialized in front of him, a spectral image of the woman he had seen earlier. Her hollow eyes stared at him, and her mouth moved soundlessly. Desperate, Dan grabbed the journal and ran to the door, but it remained locked. The whispers grew into anguished wails, and the ghostly figure reached out toward him. In a final act of desperation, Dan hurled the journal at the figure. It passed through her and hit the wall, causing a blinding flash of light. When the light faded, the door was open. Dan wasted no time, sprinting out of the building and back to his title, The Haunting Highway. Raymond Ray Collins had always prided himself on being a dependable trucker. He was known for his punctuality and his ability to handle even the most difficult routes. But one night, as he drove through the remote highways of northern Montana, he faced a nightmare that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the road. It was late October, and the temperature had dropped significantly. The sky was overcast, and a dense fog had settled over the highway, reducing visibility to almost zero. Ray's truck headlights barely pierced the gloom as he drove along the deserted stretch of Route 287, hauling a load of industrial equipment to a mining town on the edge of the mountains. The monotony of the drive was broken only by the occasional creak of the truck's suspension and the low rumble of the engine. Ray was alone, save for his radio, which played a mix of static and faint old country tunes. He kept his focus on the road, but the oppressive silence and the dense fog made the journey feel eerie and unsettling. Just past midnight, Ray spotted a flickering light in the distance. He squinted through the fog, trying to make out what it was. It looked like a lone lantern or a campfire, but there was no visible road or turnout nearby. Curious and a bit uneasy, Ray decided to pull over and investigate. He figured it might be a stranded motorist or someone in need of help. He parked his rig on the shoulder and stepped out into the cold night air. The fog enveloped him, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He followed the faint glow of the light, which seemed to be coming from an old, abandoned motel that hadn't seen business in decades. The motel's neon sign was broken, its letters flickering erratically. Ray approached the front office, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. He could hear the faint sound of music playing inside, a haunting melody that seemed oddly out of place. He stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling softly. The interior was dusty and musty, with old furniture covered in cobwebs. "Hello?" Ray called out, his voice echoing through the empty lobby. There was no response, only the persistent strains of the eerie music. He walked towards the source of the music, which seemed to be coming from a small room behind the front desk. The door was slightly ajar, and he pushed it open cautiously. Inside, he found an old jukebox, its lights flickering and its music playing an old tune that seemed oddly familiar. Ray examined the jukebox and noticed an inscription on its side, "For those who wander." He shivered, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. As he turned to leave, he heard the sound of footsteps echoing from the hallway behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. The air grew colder, and the music seemed to take on a more sinister tone. Ray decided it was time to leave, but as he headed back to the front lobby, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The fog outside had thickened, and the once familiar sight of his truck was now obscured by the dense mist. Panic set in as Ray realized he was trapped. The fog had closed in around the motel, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. He tried to call for help on his radio, but all he received was static. Desperate, Ray made his way back to the front office, hoping to find a phone or some way to contact the outside world. As he entered the lobby, he saw the ghostly figure of a woman standing behind the front desk. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her eyes hollow and her expression forlorn. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of despair. "I can't leave." Ray's heart pounded. "Who are you? What's going on here?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I'm trapped. I was a traveler, just like you, but I came here and never left. Now I'm bound to this place, forever waiting for someone to take my place." Ray's breath caught in his throat as he realized the gravity of her words. The fog outside thickened, and the jukebox's music grew louder, filling the room with a mournful tune. In a sudden burst of resolve, Ray turned and ran out of the motel, determined to find his truck. The fog was so thick that he could barely see his hand in front of his face. He stumbled and tripped, his mind racing with fear and confusion. Then, just as he was about to give up hope, he saw a faint light ahead. It was his truck's headlights, cutting through the fog. Ray ran towards them, racing with heart with relief. He climbed into the cab, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the motel fading into the mist, its lights flickering one last time before disappearing entirely. The fog began to lift, and the road ahead became clearer. Ray drove for miles, the haunting melody of the jukebox still echoing in his mind. He finally reached the mining town, the morning sun just beginning to rise. He delivered his cargo and recounted his experience to the locals. They listened with solemn expression. Title: The Last Stop. Steve O'Hara was a trucker who'd been hauling loads across the country for over 20 years. He knew every back road and shortcut like the back of his hand, but nothing had ever scared him quite like what happened on a chilly November night in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a long haul from Charleston, West Virginia, to a small, isolated factory nestled deep in the mountains. Steve had picked up a shipment of raw materials, and the factory was known for its secrecy and late-night operations. The route was familiar, but the weather was particularly harsh this evening. Rain pelted down, and the wind howled through the trees, making the roads slick and treacherous. Around midnight, Steve's headlights caught sight of a rusted sign that read, "Elmswood Rest Area, 1 mile." He decided to pull over for a quick break and check his maps. As he turned off the main road onto the dirt path leading to the rest area, the rain began to fall heavier, drumming on the truck's roof like a relentless percussion. The rest area was little more than a small, dilapidated building with a few old picnic tables and a broken-down restroom. The flickering light of a single dim street lamp cast eerie shadows across the area. Steve parked his rig and stepped out, the cold rain soaking through his jacket almost immediately. The inside of the building was damp and musty, with old newspapers strewn across the floor and a few broken vending machines. Steve shook off the rain and sat down on a creaky bench, pulling out his maps. As he pored over the routes, he heard a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere outside. It was a steady, almost mechanical beat, like a distant drum. Curious, Steve went outside, but the rain made it nearly impossible to see. He walked toward the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from the woods just beyond the rest area. The trees swayed ominously in the wind, and the thumping grew louder. As he pushed through the underbrush, Steve stumbled upon an old, rusted truck, its headlights shattered and its cargo bed covered with a thick layer of grime. The truck was out of place in the desolate surroundings, and the thumping noise was now unmistakable. It was coming from the truck's cargo area. Steve approached cautiously and opened the rusty latch. The cargo area was filled with wooden crates, and the sound was coming from inside one of them. He hesitated, his curiosity warring with his growing sense of dread. He pried open the lid of the crate, revealing a tangle of chains and shackles. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that the chains were old and rusted, but looked disturbingly well maintained. Before he could process what he was seeing, a loud, metallic clang echoed through the woods. Steve jumped and turned around, but there was no one in sight. The thumping noise stopped abruptly, replaced by a deep, guttural growl that sent chills down his spine. Panicking, Steve closed the crate and quickly made his way back to his truck. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, and visibility was almost zero. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and prepared to leave. But something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. A shadowy figure stood by the broken-down truck, its form barely visible through the rain and darkness. The figure was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the heavy rain. It seemed to be watching him, its eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Steve's heart raced as he shifted into gear and sped away from the rest area. The image of the figure burned into his mind. The rain continued to batter the truck, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. The sound of the growling and the thumping seemed to follow him, echoing through the darkness. As he navigated the treacherous mountain roads, Steve noticed something strange. His GPS was malfunctioning, constantly recalculating as if it couldn't find a signal. The road seemed to twist and turn in ways he didn't remember, and every turn seemed to lead him deeper into the darkness. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to set in. The rain had finally tapered off, but the fog had rolled in, reducing visibility to just a few feet. Steve's truck headlights barely penetrated the dense mist, and he felt completely disoriented. Suddenly, the truck's radio crackled to life, and a distorted voice came through, almost indecipherable but unmistakably human. "He's coming, the last stop is near." Steve's breath caught in his throat. He tried to turn off the radio, but the static persisted, growing louder and more frantic. The mist seemed to thicken, and the road ahead was obscured by an eerie, glowing fog. Desperation drove Steve to drive faster, hoping to outrun whatever was pursuing him. But no matter how fast he went, the fog remained, and the eerie voice continued to whisper through the static. He saw a sign for a rest area up ahead and decided to pull over, hoping to find some semblance of safety. The rest area was even more decrepit than the one he had seen earlier, with broken-down facilities and an overgrown lot. As he parked his truck, he noticed an old, dilapidated building nearby, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. The building looked like it hadn't been used in decades. He stepped out of the truck and approached the building, hoping to find help or some way to contact the outside world. Inside, he found nothing but dusty old furniture and cobwebs. The thumping noise started again, louder and more insistent. As Steve turned to leave, he saw the shadowy figure from earlier standing in the doorway. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it moved toward him with a slow, deliberate pace. Panic surged through Steve as he tried to back away, but his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The figure raised a hand, and the air grew icy cold. Steve could see his breath misting in front of him as he stumbled back, trying to escape. Just as the figure was about to reach him, the building's door slammed shut, and the thumping noise abruptly stopped. Steve bolted out of the building and back to his truck, climbing inside and starting the engine. He drove away as fast as he could, the fog gradually lifting as he left the area behind. The rest of the journey was a blur, and he finally reached the factory just as dawn was breaking. He delivered his